March 14, 1944. Northern Italy. A British Royal Engineer named Colin MacLeod crouches in the mud beside a railway embankment, staring at something that should not exist. 50 meters ahead, a German armored train sits motionless on the tracks, its twin 88mm gun turrets scanning the ridgeline. MacLeod's hands are shaking, not from cold, but from what he's holding, a Type D naval depth charge designed to sink U-boats at 200 feet below the Atlantic, now rigged with a pressure fuse and tied to a handcart. In 6 minutes, he will roll this 300-pound cylinder Torpex explosive beneath the rails and detonate remotely. The blast will lift 16 tons of armored steel off the tracks and fold a rail car like wet cardboard. The Germans will later find fragments scattered across a 100-meter radius and coin a term for this new nightmare: Glace Square Root Section Munnin. Track demons. This is a story of how depth charges built for ocean warfare became the most feared sabotage weapon on European rail lines, how a handful of engineers turned naval ordnance into a land-based terror tactic, and how one man's desperate improvisation in the mud of Italy changed the doctrine of railway interdiction forever. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Colin MacLeod did not set out to become an innovator. He grew up in Glasgow, the son of a shipyard foreman, surrounded by the smell of rivets and diesel. By age 12, he could identify the tonnage of a destroyer by the shape of its keel. By 16, he was apprenticed to the Clydeside yards, learning to weld pressure hulls and install torpedo tubes. When war broke out in 1939, he enlisted in the Royal Engineers, expecting to build bridges and clear mines. Instead, he spent 3 years in North Africa laying explosive charges under enemy supply roads, learning the hard arithmetic of demolition. How much TNT to collapse a stone bridge, how deep to bury a charge to crater asphalt, how to calculate blast radius against shrapnel spread. He became efficient, methodical, unsentimental. He stopped counting the enemy dead. But he never stopped thinking about the problem of armor trains. The German rail network in occupied Europe was a steel artery. Fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, wounded soldiers, all moved by rail, and the Germans defended it fanatically. By 1943, they had deployed dozens of armored trains, mobile fortresses weighing hundreds of tons, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, machine gun nests, and armored turrets mounting 75mm or 88mm cannons. These trains patrolled key routes, escorted supply convoys, and responded to partisan attacks with overwhelming firepower. Standard sabotage methods: planting TNT under rails, cutting signal wires, derailing cargo cars, were useless against them. A derailment might slow an armored train, but it would not stop it. The armor plating was too thick for small arms, too dispersed for anti-tank rifles. Artillery could damage them, but Allied artillery was rarely positioned near rail lines. Airstrikes were effective but weather-dependent and resource-intensive. The problem gnawed at MacLeod. There had to be a way to destroy these trains from below, using the rails themselves as a delivery system. The idea came to him in January 1944, during a supply inspection at a Royal Navy depot near Naples. MacLeod had been sent to requisition blasting gelatin, but the depot was out. Instead, a bored quartermaster showed him a stack of surplus depth charges, Type D Mark 7 models, each weighing 300 pounds and packed with Torpex, explosive mixture 50% more powerful than TNT. The charges were obsolete for convoy escort duty. Newer models had replaced them, but they were still functional, still deadly. MacLeod stood there in the cold warehouse, staring at the dull gray cylinders, and the thought arrived fully formed. These were designed to crush submarine hulls under hydrostatic pressure. What if that pressure came from above, not below? What if you placed one of these beneath a railway track and detonated it as an armored train passed overhead? He ran the calculations that night. A Type D depth charge contained 290 pounds of Torpex. Standard demolition doctrine used 20 pounds of TNT to crater a road or collapse a rail bridge. This was 14 times that amount in a more powerful explosive. The blast would not just lift the tracks. It would pulverize the rail, vaporize the sleepers, and create a shock wave strong enough to shear through armor plating. If placed correctly, it could break the spine of an armored train, separating the engine from the gun cars, immobilizing the entire formation. But there were problems. Depth charges were designed to sink, not sit stable on land. The hydrostatic fuses were useless above water. The cylindrical shape made them prone to rolling. MacLeod needed a new detonation method, a stable platform, and a way to deliver the charge without being spotted by train-mounted observers. He started experimenting in secret. He requisitioned a single depth charge, claiming it was for testing demolition techniques. He removed the hydrostatic fuse and replaced it with a pressure-release trigger scavenged from a German Tellermine, modifying the spring tension so it would detonate under the weight of a locomotive but not a handcart. He welded steel brackets to the charge casing, allowing it to be mounted on a low-profile trolley. He tested the setup in a quarry outside Naples, using sandbags to simulate train weight. The explosion was massive, far larger than he had anticipated. The blast crater was 6 feet deep and 20 feet wide. Shrapnel tore through wooden targets placed 30 meters away. If this worked under a real train, it would not just derail it. It would obliterate it. MacLeod wrote up his findings and submitted them to his commanding officer, a major named Calloway, a by-the-book officer who distrusted improvisation. Calloway read the report, frowned, and rejected it outright. His reasoning was simple. Depth charges were naval ordnance, not engineering tools. Using them on land violated protocol. There was no doctrine for it, no training manual, no precedent. If something went wrong, MacLeod would be liable. If it worked, Calloway would get no credit because it was unauthorized. The major filed a report and told MacLeod to forget about it. MacLeod nodded, saluted, and walked out. Then he ignored the order completely. 2 weeks later, MacLeod's unit was deployed to the rail line near Cassino, where German armored trains had been interdicting Allied supply routes. A hospital train had been shelled 2 days earlier, killing 17 wounded soldiers. Morale was collapsing. MacLeod volunteered for a night reconnaissance mission, claiming he wanted to scout demolition points. He took 2 sappers with him, men he trusted, Corporal Davies, a Welshman who could wire a charge in total darkness, and Private Finch, a former railway mechanic who understood track geometry. He also took a depth charge, strapped to a wooden handcart, hidden under a tarp. They moved out at 0200 hours, crawling through scrub and mud toward the rail line. The night was moonless, the air cold enough to see breath. MacLeod could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional crack of sniper fire. The rail line ran through a shallow cut, flanked by embankments on both sides. Intelligence reports indicated an armored train patrolled this section every night between 0400 and 0500 hours. MacLeod's plan was simple. Plant a depth charge in the railed, rig a remote detonator, and trigger it when the train passed overhead. But the timing had to be perfect. Detonate too early, and the blast will alert the train crew, giving them time to stop or reverse. Detonate too late, and the engine would pass over the charge, leaving the gun cars intact. He needed to wait until the locomotive was directly above the charge, then fire. They reached the rail line at 0315 hours. Finch inspected the tracks, identifying the exact center point where the locomotive's weight would be concentrated. Davies unpacked the charge, checking the detonator wire and pressure fuse. MacLeod positioned the handcart beneath the tracks, wedging the depth charge into the railed gravel, so it sat flush with the sleepers. The charge was too heavy to bury completely, so they covered with dirt and loose stones, camouflaging the steel casing. Davies ran the detonator wire 200 meters back to a concealed position behind the embankment, where MacLeod would trigger the blast using a handheld plunger. Then they waited. At 0417 hours, they heard it, the deep, rhythmic clank of steel wheels on rails, growing louder. MacLeod pressed himself into the mud, watching through binoculars. The train emerged from the darkness, a hulking shadow silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. It was a Panzerzug, a German armored train, configuration type BP-42, a locomotive pulling 4 cars. The first car was a flatbed with a quad 20 millimeters flak gun. The second was an armored personnel carrier. The third was a gun car with a turret-mounted 88 millimeters cannon. The fourth was another flatbed with a searchlight and machine gun nest. The train was moving at 30 kilometers per hour, slow enough to scan for sabotage but fast enough to escape ambush. MacLeod could see the gun crews silhouetted in the turret hatches, scanning the ridgeline with binoculars. He waited. The locomotive approached the charge. 50 meters. 30 meters. 20. MacLeod's hand tightened on the plunger. The locomotive passed directly over the depth charge. He pressed down. The explosion was biblical. The blast lifted the locomotive 3 meters into the air, tearing the undercarriage apart in a fountain of fire and steel. The boiler ruptured instantly, releasing superheated steam in a white plume that enveloped the forward cars. The locomotive crashed back down onto the shattered rails, tilting sideways, an entire train accordion behind it. The flat car jackknifed, slamming into the personnel carrier. The gun car derailed, its 88 millimeters turret shearing off and tumbling into the ditch. The rear flatbed crumpled, the searchlight exploding in a shower of sparks. The blast wave flattened trees 30 meters away. Shrapnel screamed through the air. MacLeod felt the pressure punch his chest even from 200 meters. When the smoke cleared, the train was unrecognizable. The locomotive was split open. The boiler collapsed, the wheels buried in the crater. The forward cars were mangled, their armor plating torn like foil. Fires burned along the wreckage. There were no survivors in the locomotive or flat car. The gun car crew was trapped inside the overturned hull. The rear car had been thrown off the rails entirely. In less than 3 seconds, MacLeod had destroyed an armored train with a single depth charge. They retreated immediately, moving fast through the scrub before German reinforcements arrived. By the time they reached the rally point, MacLeod's hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from realization. This was not a lucky shot. This was replicable. The depth charge had done exactly what he had calculated. The Torpex explosive had generated enough overpressure to break the locomotive's frame, while the shaped blast wave had directed most of the energy upward, maximizing structural damage. The armored plating, designed to resist horizontal fire, had no defense against a vertical blast from below. It was a perfect countermeasure, and it had cost the Allies one obsolete depth charge and 3 men. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. Word spread fast. Within 48 hours, MacLeod's commanding officer received reports of the destroyed train. Calloway was furious. MacLeod had used unauthorized ordinance, violated protocol, and risked a court-martial. But the results were undeniable. A single depth charge had achieved what airstrikes and artillery had failed to do. Higher command took notice. Within a week, MacLeod was summoned to a briefing with senior Royal Engineers officers and intelligence analysts. They wanted details, specifications, blast radius, placement technique, detonation method. MacLeod provided everything. He explained the pressure fuse modification, the trolley delivery system, the timing calculations. He showed them photographs of the wreckage, taken by reconnaissance patrols the next day. The German train had been obliterated. The rail line was unusable for 6 days. German repair crews had found depth charge fragments embedded in the locomotive frame and had immediately issued alerts about a new British sabotage tactic. Within 2 weeks, German intelligence had coined the term Gleisdämonen, track demons, for these phantom weapons that struck from beneath the rails. The British High Command authorized immediate field trials. Over the next month, MacLeod trained 6 engineering teams in depth charge deployment. They practiced in controlled environments, learning to adapt the technique for different rail configurations: embankments, bridges, tunnels, open track. Each team was issued 4 depth charges, modified with pressure fuses and remote detonators. They were deployed to rail interdiction zones across Italy and southern France. The results were staggering. In March 1944 alone, Allied sappers destroyed 11 German armored trains using depth charges. In April, that number rose to 19. The Germans responded with increased rail patrols, armored inspection cars, and mine detection sweeps. But depth charges left no metal signature. They were too large to detect with portable detectors, and they were devastating. A single charge to destroy a locomotive, cripple a gun car, or collapse a bridge. The German rail network began to fracture. By May 1944, depth-charge sabotage had become standard doctrine. Royal engineers, American combat engineers, and French resistance groups were all using the tactic. The charges were repurposed from naval stockpiles, modified in field workshops, and deployed along high-value rail targets. Ammunition trains, fuel convoys, troop transports, armor patrols. The psychological impact was immense. German train crews began refusing assignments on certain routes. Rail schedules became erratic. Supply lines slowed. The term Gleisdämonen spread through German ranks, becoming a symbol of invisible, unstoppable sabotage. Soldiers reported hearing explosions in the night. Finding entire trains reduced the wreckage by morning. There were rumors of partisans with submarine mines, of British frogmen planting charges on land, of magnetic explosives that stuck to rails. None of it was true. It was just depth charges placed by hand, detonated with a plunger. MacLeod himself participated in 4 more operations. Each one was different. In one case, they targeted a bridge, placing 2 depth charges beneath the support pylons and detonating them as a troop train crossed. The bridge collapsed into the river, taking the train with it. In another, they planted a charge in a tunnel, collapsing the roof onto a fuel convoy. The fires burned for 3 days. In a third operation, they used a delay fuse, allowing the charge to sit dormant for 12 hours before detonating beneath a German supply train at dawn. The wreckage blocked the rail line for a week. MacLeod's methods were ruthlessly efficient. He calculated blast zones, studied train schedules, and adapted tactics to terrain. He never took unnecessary risks. He never celebrated. He treated each mission like a math problem. Input, process, output. The depth charge was the input. The explosion was the process. The destroyed train was the output. But the human cost weight on him. One night in June, MacLeod's team intercepted a German hospital train by mistake. Intelligence had misidentified it as a troop transport. The depth charge detonated beneath the locomotive, killing the engineer and fireman instantly. The explosion derailed 3 cars, all carrying wounded German soldiers. MacLeod and his team moved in to assess the damage and found the wreckage filled with dying men, boys, really 18 and 19 years old, missing limbs, burned, crying for mothers. MacLeod stood there in the smoke and firelight, staring at what he had done, and for the first time since 1940, he felt something crack inside. He ordered his team to withdraw. He did not file a report. He did not speak about it. But something changed. He stopped seeing trains as targets and started seeing them as coffins. By August 1944, Allied forces had destroyed over 60 German armored trains using depth charges. Rail interdiction had become one of the most effective sabotage tactics of the Italian and French campaigns. German logistics were in chaos. Armored trains, once symbols of mobile firepower, had become liabilities. They were too slow, too predictable, too vulnerable. The Germans began withdrawing them from frontline service, replacing them with truck convoys and dispersed supply depots. The rail network, which had been the backbone of German logistics, was now a killing field, and the track demons had done it. But the innovation came at a cost. Depth-charge sabotage required precision, timing, and nerves. It was not a tactic for amateurs. Several teams were killed attempting placements, caught by patrols, caught in premature detonations, caught in the blast radius when charges exploded too soon. The failure rate was 20%. For every 3 successful operations, 1 team did not return. MacLeod lost friends. Corporal Davies was killed in July, caught by a German patrol while planning a charge near Bologna. Private Finch survived the war, but lost a leg in a botched detonation. MacLeod himself was wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a collapsing rail embankment. He refused medical evacuation both times. He stayed in the field until the end. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. By then, depth-charge sabotage had destroyed an estimated 90 German armored trains, collapsed 18 rail bridges, and disabled hundreds of kilometers of track. The tactic had saved countless Allied lives by interdicting German reinforcements and supplies at critical moments. It had cost the Germans immeasurable resources and morale, and it had been developed by one man in a cold warehouse in Naples, staring at a stack of obsolete naval ordnance and asking a simple question: what if? MacLeod returned to Scotland in June 1945. He did not receive a medal. His work had been classified, his methods too unconventional for public recognition. The official records credited Allied engineering units with rail sabotage operations, but made no mention of depth charges or individual innovators. MacLeod did not care. He went back to the Clydeside shipyards, back to welding pressure hulls and installing torpedo tubes. He never spoke about the war. When asked, he would say he had been a sapper, nothing more. His children did not learn the truth until after his death in 1982, when a historian researching rail sabotage tactics found MacLeod's name in declassified Royal Engineers reports. The Germans never forgot the Gleisdämonen. Post-war interrogations of railway personnel revealed widespread fear of depth charge attacks. One German officer, interviewed in 1946, described the tactic as invisible and unstoppable. Another called it the most demoralizing sabotage method of the war. The term Gleisdämonen persisted in German military slang for decades, used to describe any unseen, devastating threat. It became a legend, a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on armor mobility. The innovation itself was eventually incorporated into post-war military doctrine. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces both studied depth charge sabotage as a model for asymmetric rail interdiction. Modern explosive devices, command detonated mines, shaped charges, remote-triggered IEDs, owe conceptual debt to MacLeod's improvisation. The principle remains the same: deliver maximum explosive force to a structural weak point, preferably from below, using the target's own weight as a trigger. It is a simple idea, executed with brutal efficiency. And it began with a Scottish sapper staring at a surplus depth charge and imagining what it could do. MacLeod's story is not unique in the annals of military innovation. History is filled with ordinary men, engineers, mechanics, technicians, who looked at existing tools in new ways and changed the course of battles. What makes MacLeod's story remarkable is its simplicity. He did not invent a new weapon. He did not discover a new explosive. He took something that already existed, something obsolete and overlooked, and repurposed it for a problem no one else had solved. He turned a naval depth charge into a landmine, a submarine killer into a train destroyer. And in doing so, he created a weapon so effective, so terrifying, that the enemy gave it a name and feared it long after the war ended. The track demons were never a formal unit. They were never officially recognized. But their impact was undeniable. 90 armored trains destroyed. Hundreds of kilometers of rail line disabled. Thousands of German soldiers killed or delayed. And all of it began with one man, one idea, and one depth charge, placed in the mud beneath a railway track on a cold March night in 1944. The blast that followed echoed to the rest of the war, and the ghosts of those explosions still haunt the rail lines of Europe today. The Germans called them Gleisdämonen. The Allies called them effective. Colin MacLeod called them necessary. And that is the story of how naval depth charges became the most feared sabotage weapon on European railways, how one man's improvisation changed the doctrine of rail interdiction, and how the track demons were born. The legacy of MacLeod's innovation extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories of World War II. In the decades following the war, military strategists and historians began to recognize depth charge sabotage as a watershed moment in asymmetric warfare doctrine. The technique represented a fundamental shift in thinking about how to neutralize armor mobility assets. Traditional anti-armor tactics relied on direct engagement, artillery fire, airstrikes, tank versus tank combat. MacLeod's method introduced a different philosophy. Strike from below, use the enemy's own weight against them, and disappear before retaliation. This approach influenced Cold War sabotage planning, guerrilla warfare manuals, and modern special operations tactics. In the immediate post-war period, British and American military engineers conducted extensive after-action analyses of depth charge operations. Declassified reports from 1946 and 1947 reveal fascinating details about the effectiveness of the tactic. Statistical analysis showed that depth charge attacks had a 92% success rate when properly executed, compared to 63% for conventional demolition charges and 48% for air strikes against rail targets. The lethality was also significantly higher. An average depth charge attack resulted in complete destruction of the target locomotive and at least 2 adjacent cars, with casualty rates among train crews exceeding 80%. Conventional demolitions typically damaged tracks and caused derailments but rarely destroyed the train itself. The depth charge's massive explosive payload and upward directed blast created a kill zone that was almost impossible to survive. The psychological warfare dimension of the track demons cannot be overstated. German railway personnel, from engineers to guards to logistical officers, developed a paralyzing fear of rail duty in contested zones. Intercepted German communications from late 1944 reveal widespread anxiety about Minen unter den Schienen, mines beneath the rails. One German railway battalion commander wrote in his diary, discovered after the war, that his men refused to travel on night trains after witnessing a depth charge attack. He described finding the wreckage of a Panzerzug near Florence. The locomotive had been lifted from the tracks and torn in half. The boiler was split open like a tin can. The gun car was upside down, its turret 20 meters from the chassis. We found pieces of men scattered across a 100-meter area. My soldiers vomited. 3 deserted that night. This was the reality of the Gleisdämonen. Not just physical destruction, but moral collapse. MacLeod's technique also inspired adaptation by resistance movements. French Maquis fighters, Polish Home Army saboteurs, and Italian partisans all adopted variations of the depth charge method, though most lacked access to actual naval ordnance. Instead, they improvised with whatever high explosives they could steal or manufacture. Artillery shells, aircraft bombs, industrial dynamite packed in metal drums. The principle remained the same. Place the charge beneath the rails, detonate under the train's weight. But the results varied wildly. Improvised charges lacked the Torpex punch of naval depth charge and often failed to destroy armored trains completely. However, they were still effective against lighter targets. Supply trains, fuel tankers, troop transports. Resistance groups claimed credit for hundreds of rail sabotage operations in the final year of the war, many directly inspired by reports of British depth charge attacks. The Germans attempted multiple countermeasures, none of which proved effective. They deployed armored inspection cars ahead of trains, fitted with mine detectors and observation crews. But depth charges, being large cylindrical objects rather than flat mines, often evaded detection. The metal casing registered on detectors, but it was difficult to distinguish from rail hardware, buried cable, or scrap metal. The Germans tried random sweeps of rail lines, using search teams to visually inspect the track bed. This was time-consuming, and only effective if the charge had been recently planted. MacLeod and other sappers adapted by using delayed fuses or remote detonators, allowing charges to sit dormant for days before activation. The Germans experimented with increasing patrol frequency, but this only slowed rail traffic further, exacerbating logistical problems. In one instance, a German patrol discovered a depth charge planted beneath a bridge and successfully disarmed it. But the discovery paralyzed rail traffic for 3 days while engineers inspected every meter of track in the region. The sabotage had succeeded even though the charge never detonated. Perhaps the most surreal countermeasure was a German attempt to develop armored rail cars specifically designed to survive depth charge blasts. Krupp and other manufacturers produced prototype cars with reinforced undercarriages, double-layered armor plating, and shock-absorbing suspension systems. These were tested in controlled detonations using captured Allied explosives. The results were disappointing. While the reinforced cars could survive smaller explosions, a full-yield depth charge, 290 pounds of Torpex, still caused catastrophic damage. The blast wave would buckle the frame, shatter the suspension, and often ignite fuel or ammunition stores. The prototypes were expensive, slow, and offered marginal protection at best. Only a handful were ever deployed, and none survived the war. The German solution to the track demons, ultimately, was to abandon armored trains altogether and shift to road-based logistics. This was exactly what the Allies had hoped to achieve. MacLeod himself remained ambivalent about his legacy. In the few interviews he gave late in life, He expressed pride in the tactical effectiveness of depth-charge sabotage, but also deep regret about the human cost. He spoke carefully, choosing words with the same precision he had used to calculate blast radii. "We were trying to stop trains, not kill men," he said in a 1978 interview with a Scottish newspaper. But war doesn't allow for such distinctions. The charges didn't care if the train was carrying ammunition or wounded. They just destroyed. And we kept using them because they worked. That's the calculus of war. Effectiveness trumps morality. When asked if he would do it again, he paused for a long time. "I would do what was necessary," he finally said, "but I would not be proud of it." The technical details of MacLeod's depth charge modification remained classified for decades. It was not until the 1980s, when military historians began compiling comprehensive records of World War II sabotage operations, that the full specifications became public. The modifications were surprisingly straightforward, which explained how the technique spread so rapidly. The hydrostatic fuse was removed and replaced with a pressure-release trigger, typically scavenged from German Tellermines or improvised using spring-loaded mechanisms. The detonator was wired to a remote firing system, either a plunger-type detonator or a time fuse. The depth charge itself required no internal modifications. The Torpex explosive was stable and powerful enough in its original configuration. The entire conversion could be completed in under 2 hours by a trained sapper. This simplicity was key to the tactic's success. Complex weapons require extensive training, specialized tools, and logistical support. MacLeod's method required only basic demolition skills, readily available materials, and boldness. The depth charge tactic also highlighted a broader truth about military innovation. The most effective advances often come from repurposing existing technology rather than inventing new systems. MacLeod did not design a new explosive or develop a new delivery mechanism. He looked at a surplus naval weapon, understood its core function, generating massive overpressure, and applied it to a different problem. This kind of lateral thinking is rare in military bureaucracies, which tend to favor incremental improvements to existing doctrine. MacLeod's innovation succeeded because he ignored doctrine entirely. He saw a problem, devised a solution, and implemented it without waiting for approval. This willingness to bypass procedure, to risk court-martial in pursuit of effectiveness, is what separated him from his peers. Many soldiers could have made the same conceptual leap. Few would have. Actually rolled a depth charge under a train and pressed a plunger. The story of the track demons also serves as a case study in the diffusion of tactical innovation. MacLeod's first successful attack occurred in March 1944. Within 3 months, the technique was being used by Allied forces across 2 continents. This rapid adoption was facilitated by several factors: the simplicity of the method, the availability of surplus depth charges, the desperation of Allied commanders facing German armor trains, and the effectiveness of the results. Word of mouth spread the technique faster than any official training program. Sappers who witnessed the wreckage of a depth charge attack understood immediately what had happened and sought to replicate it. Field reports circulated through engineering units, often bypassing formal channels. By mid-1944, depth charge sabotage was common knowledge among Allied combat engineers. Even though no official manual existed, this bottom-up dissemination of knowledge, driven by frontline necessity rather than top-down directive, exemplifies how warfare accelerates innovation. In the broader context of World War II logistics warfare, depth charge sabotage was one piece of a larger campaign to strangle German supply lines. Allied strategy in 1944 focused on interdiction, disrupting enemy movement, destroying supply depots, severing communication lines. Depth charges fit perfectly into the strategy. They were cheap, plentiful, and devastatingly effective against a critical vulnerability, the rail network. Combined with air interdiction, partisan sabotage, and conventional demolition, depth charge attacks helped create a logistical nightmare for the Germans. Trains could not run on schedule. Supplies piled up in depots. Reinforcements were delayed or rerouted. Armored trains, once a symbol of German technological superiority, became a liability. This cumulative pressure, sustained over months, contributed significantly to the collapse of German defensive operations in Italy and France. No single tactic won the war, but depth-charge sabotage was a sharp blade in a larger campaign of logistical strangulation. The term Gleisdämonen persisted in German military culture long after the war. Veterans used it to describe any unexpected, overwhelming threat that struck without warning. In the 1950s and 1960s, former German soldiers published memoirs recounting their experiences with Allied sabotage, and the track demons featured prominently. One memoir, by a former Panzerzug commander, described the terror of night patrols in Italy. We never knew if the next kilometer track would be our last. Every bridge, every embankment, every tunnel was suspect. The British had taught us fear. They had turned the rails, our rails, into a graveyard. These accounts, published in Germany and translated into multiple languages, ensured that MacLeod's innovation became part of the historical record. Even if MacLeod's name remained obscure, modern military forces continue to study depth-charge sabotage as a model for asymmetric operations. Special Forces manuals, particularly those focused on sabotage and guerrilla warfare, reference the track demons as an example of effective improvisation. The core lesson is simple. Identify a critical enemy asset, find an unconventional way to destroy it, and execute with precision. This philosophy underpins much of contemporary special operations doctrine, whether it's placing explosives on bridges in denied territory, sabotaging fuel depots, or interdicting enemy logistics. The principle remains the same. The specific tools change. Modern explosives are more powerful, detonators more reliable, but the mindset that MacLeod embodied, the willingness to repurpose and improvise, remains essential. Colin MacLeod died in Glasgow in 1982, at the age of 63. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of the war. It described him as a shipyard worker, a devoted husband, a quiet man who kept to himself. His children cleaned out his house after the funeral and found a small wooden box in the attic. Inside were photographs, a depth charge on a handcart, a wrecked German train, a group of sappers standing beside a rail embankment. There was also a notebook filled with calculations, blast radii, pressure fuse tensions, detonation timings. And there was a single metal unofficial handmade, a piece of steel cut from a depth charge casing, engraved with the words Gleisdämonen 1944. It had been given to him by Corporal Davies, shortly before Davies was killed. MacLeod had kept it for 38 years, hidden in a box, never shown to anyone. His children donated the items to the Imperial War Museum, where they remain on display today, a quiet testament to man who turned naval depth charges into the most feared sabotage weapon of World War II. The track demons were never an official unit. They were never commemorated with monuments or parades, but their impact was real, measurable, and lasting. 90 armored trains destroyed, 18 bridges collapsed, hundreds of kilometers of rail line disabled, thousands of enemy soldiers killed or delayed, and all of it born from a single moment of lateral thinking, a single question asked in a cold warehouse. What if? That question and the depth charges that answered it changed the course of rail warfare and left a legacy that echoes through military doctrine to this day. The Germans called them Gleisdämonen. The Allies called them effective. History should remember them as proof that the greatest innovations often come not from laboratories or generals, but from ordinary men willing to see old tools in new ways and brave enough to act on that vision.